Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Conscience and Justice Council. We have one of our distinguished members who's also a panelist, Pastor Kerwin Jones from the Houston International Church in Houston, Texas. Pastor Jones, we just want to give a recap real quick, put you on the spot about the Conscience and Justice Council annual convention that took place in St. Louis, Missouri, 10 years after Ferguson, walking or talking. What a time we had. Go ahead and just share a little bit with the audience, your experience and what took place.
Yeah, definitely awesome experience. For me, it just gets better every year. We had, of course, we got kicked off with Pastor Flagar, man. He really just went in on ministry and some of the things he did. I mean, all the plenary sessions were good. All of the um, workshops we had were good. This is an amazing conference, and I just want to just say anybody who's even thinking about coming, man, you need to come. It's one of the highlights of my year as far as religious liberty, and so just want to invite everybody to be a part of it. And it's just been a great experience. And also we add an addition for pastors at the end with Pastor Clavel Hunter, which just really tops it off. And so I want to just say, man, anybody who's thinking about coming, pastor, layperson, religious liberty, whatever, just come out and join us, and you will definitely be enriched and blessed and empowered to go out and do real ministry in the community. Yes, excellent.
Appreciate that. Once again, next year our convention will take place in Huntsville, Alabama. Huntsville, Alabama, September 25th to the 28th. September 25th to the 28th. And we should have an announcement hopefully next month as to all the details of what's taking place. This evening, we're very happy to continue our Christian Nationalism and Privilege series entitled What's Love Got to Do with It? And Pastor Kerwin Jones, you have been a part of this series so that we can bring truth to power and speak out to people about the dangers of Christian nationalism. And we have done a number of different shows, with regards to um, Christian nationalism and privilege from a religious liberty standpoint, from a worship standpoint. And we just have another opportunity to talk about what's love got to do with it. And talking about Christian national privilege and Project 2025.
Yeah.
Is love the ideal or is it a reality? Is love the ideal or is it a reality? And we're very happy to have some distinguished guests that will be joining you as well as myself tonight. We have none other than Michael Allen. He holds the Harvey Wexler Chair in Political Science at Bryn Mawr College, where he has taught for over 30 years. Professor Allen is an ordained elder at the West Philadelphia Seventh-day Adventist Church and has served on the executive committee for Allegheny East Conference and is currently a member of the Board of Trustees at Pine Forge Academy in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. We have no other than Dr. Olive Hemings. Like Dr. Olive Hemings is the chair of the theology department at WAU. It's named in honor of the former president of the Allegheny East Conference, none other than Pastor Butch Fordham and his lovely wife. And we're very happy to have her here as well. And last but not least, we also have Dr. Timothy Golden, who's a visiting professor of philosophy at Whitman College. You can tell by his seriousness, as well as Dr. Allen's seriousness, that they hail from Philadelphia, where they may feel eagles are superior until they see the stars align. But we're very happy to have each and every one of them here, and we're going to give them an opportunity to talk about this particular topic, Christian nationalism and privilege. What's love got to do with it? Obviously, there's a flair or a shout out to Tina Turner, but there's a lot of misconceptions with regards to Christian nationalism and privilege, a lot of misconceptions about Project 2025, a lot of misconceptions about was whether or not it's really the love of Christ. And so, without further ado, we're going to kick it off with Dr. Michael Allen. And then from Dr. Allen, we will go to Dr. Hemings. Then from Dr. Hemings, we'll go to Pastor Jones, and then conclude with Dr. Golden.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for your invitation. I'm happy to be here. And thank you for the question that around which our conversation is organized this evening. I couldn't help but go back to Jesus' charge in his last discourse before his crucifixion in John, where he charged his followers to approach leadership and civic life in a different spirit from the way in which the Romans and other powers approached it. And he said that in my kingdom of love, power is used under people to lift them up rather than above people to push them down. So the concept of servant leadership is central to Jesus' conception of his kingdom. So with that introduction about the contrast between how most kingdoms operate and how God's kingdom operates, the question arises for those who claim to be followers of Christ. As we look at their agenda, does it look more like pressing down with power, or does it look more like lifting up with power? And I would submit that at this stage in the US's political economy and history, among other transitions and challenges such as climate change and the huge wealth and health gaps that we have in the country, I would suggest 3 transitions that the US is facing. And I'll just mention them briefly, and then in conversation we can bring them out in more detail. I'll list them first and then make some points about each. We are seeing a transition in the forms of capitalism that are practiced in the country, from an assertion of neoliberalism, that is, say, open markets, open trade with other countries, to a reassertion of a nationalist capitalism, bringing jobs home, onshoring and nearshoring of jobs, and creating an American market that suits the American population first before, or to make the wealth of corporations organized in a different way. So that's a transition that's going on, and its implications are described later. The second transition that is happening in the society is one in social composition, where the size of the white majority is declining. And although it's still above 70%, the younger generations are becoming more balanced in its ethnic composition. And that has implications for all kinds of questions. And the third transition I would like to mention is a transition from democracy to authoritarianism, or the mixture of authoritarian practices and approaches within what are ostensibly democratic institutions. So let me say some things about each one briefly. Regarding the economy, the wealth gaps that we saw with the introduction of neoliberalism in the 1980s under Reagan and the 1990s during the Clinton administrations and the Bush administrations produced what some people call a wine glass society. That is to say, the top is very full and the champagne flowed. The bottom was a small bottom, and the middle was a thin stem. Resulting from the hollow out of manufacturing jobs to other countries, because it suited the corporations more to lower the price of labor within the US by sending manufacturing to East Asia and other countries. So that had profound implications for income distribution and for social structure in the society, and was to lead to lots of resentment, particularly among the white working class. And this was a policy of both Democratic and Republican parties. The Democrats would do that kind of neoliberalism with some attention to social reform. The Republicans would pay less attention to social reform and less attention to environmental remedies, or at least remediations, if not remedies. In terms of the social composition and the changing demographics, we see an aging of the population, hence the anxiety about reproduction rates, particularly among the majority population. And then the question of belonging and purpose. There came to be a crisis of purpose in the society. What is the United States about? And what defines the cohesion of the society, if any? And therefore a search for new bases of social cohesion and national identity. And this was permeated throughout the culture. We saw it manifested in the culture wars of the late 1970s through to the present, And that took various permutations under different leaders in the media, in the pulpits, in popular culture, and so on. So, in a sense, the majority culture must keep its dominance by some kind of proto-nationalist policies, or encouraging migration from Europe and discouraging migration from countries where peoples of color are the majority. That is to say, policies broadly under these two patterns: the economic patterns hollowing out the middle of the society, and the demographic patterns weakening the reproductive rates in the majority, has largely helps us to put in context what the migration policies are, what the reproductive policies are, and policies on public health tend to be. And then with respect to democracy and authoritarianism, the social coalitions that control the state, meaning the federal government and public authorities generally, that becomes a site of contestation. People want to control the discourses in the media, in the libraries, in the schools, in the universities, because there's a competition to frame the questions of identity. What is the country about, and what should our values be? What should be the economic strategies? What social engineering should look like, and what the electoral map should look like. So you can see how the policies of gerrymandering and so on are all reflected in these broader long-term patterns that I'm mentioning. And we can see it in the culture wars since the 1970s, as I mentioned. We see it in the attempt to re-engineer the federal government, which is a large part of what the Project 25 is about. The interesting thing about the federal government since Reconstruction, it has been a site of some correction to the inequalities of the society. It was federal troops in the South that protected the gains of the emancipated people. And when they were withdrawn under political compromise and pressure, we saw the decline of Reconstruction and the entry of Jim Crow. And in the Great Society of the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson, the federal government became a site of some reform attempt to correct through social engineering in housing, healthcare, education, and so on. So the federal government then becomes a site for those who want to preserve power by weakening the federal institutions, Department of Education, National Institutes of Health, research funding for universities, and to control the agenda of science and technology, control the agenda of discourse, control the debates in the universities and the libraries. So that's a trend that can be put in context there. So if you can weaken the federal government, you can weaken the site where minority rights are protected and policies that do some measure of social redress take place. So Project 25 is only the latest stop in a long struggle to weaken the powers and authority of these federal agencies, because this is a place where bargaining takes place with big business and with the majority white electoral base. And we've seen earlier phases of this back in the even during the Nixon administration, something called the New Federalism was introduced. And then we saw it repeated under Reagan in the early 1980s. It's basically it's an idea of taking money from the federal government and devolving it to the states, and basically saying to the states, do what you like with it in terms of education and healthcare and so on. And we can wash our hands of those policies and not enforce national civil rights and education and redress policies at the federal level. So that's what that agenda is about. It's not new, it's just the latest iteration of a long game, going back to the reversal of Reconstruction. So Christian nationalism then is about preserving privilege and not about love. It is about the attempt to control the state, to weaken it, and to strengthen those institutions of civil society that try to control the discourse and the legislation on behalf of a certain understanding of majoritarian control. And we can say some more things around that, but it's been a bit of a long introduction, but I'll stop there and we can come back to that in conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. Dr. Hemings.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Allen, for that political, socio-political background there, and again, pointing out what Christian nationalism is about. If I may underscore that Christian nationalists believe that America is a Christian nation. It believes that our political institutions should be governed by Christian values. Um, and However, Christianity is not really, living as Christians or as being Christians as the gospel presents. It's not really the agenda of Christian nationalism. Christianity simply is a tool to allow a certain Christians, a kind of certain kind of white Christian with a certain kind of theology and a certain kind of theology, a certain kind of worldview, to allow their agenda to dominate. Um, so their idea is that their idea is that God made America for Christians, specifically a certain kind of Christians or white. Now, this doesn't mean that all Christian nationalists are white. There are lots of Americans who are bought into the agenda because they're really not a majority group. They're a minority group, and so they need proxies among other social groups. Now, that being said, because their idea is for them to own America, the fact now that so many that I would say America's because of the demographic shift in America, there is now a lot of fear and anxiety among this, what did I say, those who feel themselves the dominant group and should remain the dominant group. So that anxiety, that fear, and so forth is now being transformed into what Dr. Allen there refers to as culture war. A culture war that they are intent on winning. And as I'm saying, the gospel is not the agenda. What is happening is that Christianity, being a very powerful force in Western world, is now used to carry that agenda of greed, of fear, of anxiety, because that is what Christian nationalism is driven by: greed, fear, and anxiety, and the determination of a particular social class in America, specifically white males, along with perhaps their female consorts, but white male is the thing, to dominate American social, religious, political life, so that that group of people can continue to own America, or America can serve all the benefits, all the goods of America can be basically controlled by them. Now, as I said, this definitely does not reflect the gospel. I want us to understand that in the first century, Jesus was confronting a similar situation. Do not be deceived. He was confronting a similar religious situation where his own religion was no longer reflecting the teachings of the prophets about justice, about taking care of the poor and the powerless and the incarcerated. That's why he got up in the temple and said, read from the prophet Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor." All right. To bring sight to the blind, to set at liberty those that are oppressed, to bring in the year of Jubilee, the year of liberation, the time of God's liberation. And of course, he was crucified as a result. So when Mark records Jesus saying, "If anyone wants to follow me, let them deny themselves, take up the cross and follow," It was a profound political statement, because what it is saying wasn't necessarily speaking. We might think they're speaking to pagans or whatever. The gospel, for the most part, is speaking to the religious people. Deny yourselves, put away this narcissistic um, religious culture where the focus is on a religious system and how much they can dominate the system and be dominant in the system, but rather look to denying yourself and taking up the cross. And many times when Christians preach about taking up the cross, they're talking about a religion. The cross here for Jesus, again, is a political statement. To what extent are you willing to lay down your life for your fellow human? Jesus says, if anyone wants to follow me, if we want to preach a gospel, it's a gospel about a cross of self-denial. And what does that mean? What is that cross? In John, when he's presenting the Jesus story, he says, greater love has no one than this, that one lays down his life for his friends. Now, Christian nationalism, they're calling you to lay down your life for your religion, to lay down your life for certain ideologies, to enter the culture war, to make sure that the, the women do not have too much power, the Hispanics and the immigrants do not come in and take away our goods, to make sure that, people of non-heterosexual male persons or non-male persons do not, become too dominant and get too much of the pie. That to them, is what it means to lay down their lives. Okay, but Jesus didn't ask us to lay down our lives for ideology. Jesus asked us to lay down our lives for religion. Jesus didn't ask us to lay down our lives for our faith, whatever that means. Jesus asked us to lay down our lives for our fellow human, to defend their dignity, to defend their rights, to make sure that people live as comfortably as I want to live. That is what love has to do with it. And Christian nationalism has missed the mark. And so those who are truly Christians, who truly want to preach a gospel, it's time for us now to preach the gospel to Christian nationalists. And I am very encouraged that in this current election, there are many evangelicals who are coming out now and calling out Christian nationalism, so that you have, evangelicals for Harris. And it's not so much for Harris. It's really against a system that is now, as it were, using Christianity as a political tool and as a tool of war. And so when we talk about love, let us ask the question, who among Christian nationalists is willing to deny themselves, to actually take up the cross and follow, to lay down their lives for immigrants, for Black people, for women, for LGBTQ persons? This is what Jesus asked us to do as Christians.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hemings. Pastor Jones.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say love has nothing to do with it. It's anti-Christian. The whole concept of Christian nationalism is anti-Christ. And that's what the Bible calls it. It calls it anti-Christ, anti-Christian, the spirit that wants to dominate. And when you look at the characteristics of Jesus versus the characteristics of Christian nationalism, of course, they're unopposed. They're opposed. And of course, the gospel, when you look at the 10 Commandments, loving God with all your heart, soul, and mind, then loving your neighbor as yourself. On these two things hangs all the law and the prophets. And of course, John, James would say, show me your faith without your works, and I'll show you my faith by my works, in the context of showing love to a neighbor. And so Christian nationalism is totally anti-Christ. It has nothing to do with Jesus. It is more of the Barabbas type religion, and where give us Barabbas, we just want what we want at the expense of even the characteristics of Christianity. When you think about the cross, Jesus had healed the sick, raised the dead. It was evidence that he was the Son of God. But when you want political power, then you're willing to compromise even Christ himself to be able to get what you want in exchange for someone as a murderer, someone as a thief, someone who committed murder right before you, because you just want the power. You want to get rid of anything that doesn't give you or portray that. And of course, we know the problem that the problem with Jesus was that he kept saying, "My kingdom is not of this world," and he would go heal the sick, and so the concept of a Christian nationalism or a Christian nation is totally anti-Christ. It has nothing to do with Jesus. And whenever man gets that type of power, we've seen what it does throughout history, right? I mean, there's absolutely, when you look at history, the history of the church in particular, you just see how much trouble was in the land when you had national Christianity. And so I think just for thinking people, it should be clear, clear evidence that Christian nationalism is not Christianity. It is just a V for power and domination over the conscience, which again is anti-Christ in its nature. So love has absolutely nothing to do with it at all.
Mm.
Thank you so much, Pastor Jones. Dr. Golden.
Thank you, Woody, and thanks so much to my fellow panelists. I don't know how much there is left for me to say because the table has been set for me so well by my colleagues on this panel here. I would begin by emphasizing some insights from the African American legal theorist Derek Bell, who put forth a thesis about racism in the United States that was very controversial. And it's a very simple thesis, which is that racism is not an aberration. It is not an ugly stain on an otherwise pure garment of American democracy. Instead, it is a permanent feature of America's legal and political landscape. And I would add to that, social and theological landscape. What this means is not that there is no hope, which is what he was often criticized for, but rather that we have an obligation as moral beings to resist it, even though it is never going away. Despite the urgency of this moment in this presidential election, if Kamala Harris is elected president, Project 2025 is not going anywhere. It is going to remain around because you cannot kill an idea. And in many ways, the hostility toward the federal government, which has sort of always existed among conservatives and that was exacerbated by many whites witnessing a Black person be the head of that federal government for 8 years, is a hostility that isn't going anywhere because you can't kill an idea. These Project 2025, in some sense, begins with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise that ended Reconstruction. Frederick Douglass was asked by the governor of Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes, whether he should adopt a policy of conciliation toward the South in compromise with Samuel Tilden to end the election contest of 1876 in exchange for allowing the South to be autonomous. And when Douglass was asked what he thought the governor should do, Douglass said, "I think the South needs to be reminded that there's a God in Israel and that you ought not cast your pearls before swine." And as Dr. Allen pointed out in his introductory remarks, the federal government, like it or not, has generally been a friend of Black people and those who are oppressed. Indeed, when you study the history of the Department of Justice, it was founded in large part to protect newly freed slaves from white racial terror in southern states. And so when that protection was removed, this is what we got was Jim Crow, black codes, lynching, etc. So I think love has nothing to do, as Pastor Jones just pointed out, love has nothing to do with Christian nationalism, but love has everything to do with how we respond to Christian nationalism. By the way, there is an implicit third term that should precede the phrase Christian nationalism, and that is white. Dr. Hemings pointed that out in her remarks, that there is a certain kind of Christian, right? A white Christian. It's interesting to note, and I'll close with this observation, that white Christian nationalism feeds on a certain level of abstraction in three distinct areas. One, in social and political theory, two, in legal theory, and third, in Christian theology. If we go back to social and political thought, so much of it is derived from thought experiments of whites who are able to abstract and presume an idyllic state of affairs in which all human beings are considered to be free and equal. This is the anthropology that we get in classical social contract theory from people like John Locke. We get this idea that there was once a time when everyone was free and equal, and that empirically is just false, right? And the great political philosopher Charles Mills pointed out throughout his career that the problem with this idyllic state of nature and this abstraction is that you never get to address actual historical injustices. So from John Locke to John Rawls in political theory, we have these abstract thought experiments that prevent any meaningful engagement with actual historical conditions that can exact justice. So that's in social and political theory. We see it also, abstraction, that is, this problem, in legal theory. I mentioned earlier the African American legal theorist Derek Bell, who throughout his work offered trenchant critiques of the Supreme Court's understanding of law as it relates to race. For example, in the Supreme Court's recent decision on affirmative action, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, one of the criticisms that Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson leveled against the majority opinion is that the opinion is entirely ahistorical, that the opinion does not account for America's first attempt at affirmative action, which was the congressional promotion of and ultimate ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which were ratified with the express purpose of helping newly freed slaves. If we are to, from a legal standpoint, interpret the 14th Amendment on an originalist view, that is, if originalism means anything other than the vindication of white supremacy, then we have to take seriously this idea. And it would seem that the result of the affirmative action case should have been the exact opposite of what it was. Mm-hmm. That we would actually have race conscious remedies, what the Supreme Court used to call benign categories of racial discrimination, as opposed to invidious ones, in order to help rectify historical injustices. So there's a problem of abstraction in social and political theory. We also see it in legal theory. And lastly, perhaps the most pernicious kind of abstraction is what we see in Christian theology. When we study the scriptures, it becomes clear to us in the Gospel of John that the Logos, or the Word, is in the beginning. And that by the time we move from John 1:1 to John 1:14, that word has become, in the Greek, sarx, or flesh. It becomes embodiment. It becomes historical. And rather than deal with the actual historical Jesus, this is why I never understand the sort of schizophrenic view of conservative Christian apologetics. Because on one hand, you want to prove that there was an actual historical Jesus, but on the other hand, you don't want to account for his actual history as the son of a poor carpenter who had to make his way through the lower classes in his life in first century Palestine. Somehow, I think what troubles a lot of more conservative interpretations of Christology is that if you actually pay attention to the conditions under which Jesus lived, it resonates too deeply with the conditions of many poor Black people in America and around the world today. So now you have a Christ that cannot belong to white supremacy, but you have a Christ that must belong to all of those who Jesus called in Matthew 25 the least of these. And Dr. Hemings did a nice job also of pointing that out. So I think that this penchant for abstraction is really problematic, because instead of making the word flesh, white Christian nationalism works to make Jesus's colonized, ghettoized flesh into an abstract word, because to account for Jesus's historical conditions is actually to be accountable as a white person for the legacy of white supremacy that haunts us to this day.
Well said. Well said.
Thank you for that. Once again, I want to encourage our audience. You've heard from each of our four distinguished panelists, their perspective with regards to Christian nationalism and privilege. What's love got to do with it? But we also want to hear from you and answer your questions and your comments. One of the things I've kept hearing throughout the responses is cultural wars. Cultural wars. Please define cultural wars and the harmful effect it may have when it comes to addressing humanitarian issues. Once again, please define cultural wars and the harming effect it can have when it comes to addressing humanitarian issues.
Well, I would say it has to do with questions of beauty, ethics, social and public policy practices, which is why we find that the articulations of these ideas, what is desirable, what is fair and unfair, what should be taught to children, the history that we should understand together. Our people's history is integral to their culture, the present understanding. So history is not past. The history is something that we deal with. It's a resource for the present and for the future. So how we interpret the history, what we leave out and what we put in, are reflections of the ethical and aesthetic priorities of a society. And the curious thing about cultural wars is that they are not neutral. It's not a neutral terrain. Not only in history and in theology and in legal theory, but in any application of reason to collective human problems, we understand the reasonings by the agenda. So reason is not neutral. Arguments are not neutral. They come from somewhere. They're motivated by some agenda or some pressure or some imperative. So that our hermeneutic is never neutral. Our hermeneutic comes from our motives. So the first thing to examine is, what are the motives? What are the deep longings of the heart that are driving our selections from history, from scripture, from legal precedent, from fact, that we by which we shape our narratives and the stories we tell each other and the stories we tell our children, and the textbooks we allow in the public school system, and the legal theories we argue against in the law schools, and the tenets that we argue for in departments of philosophy and economics and politics. So it's all the learned patterns of human language and communication and reasonings that I would describe as cultural and as sites of struggle.
It is important to keep in mind that an integral part of the culture wars at some point is to play the zero sum game that if I win, you must lose.
Mm-hmm.
And this has resulted most recently in the scapegoating of Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, and in the scapegoating of transgendered persons. When you tell people that if a certain candidate wins, that your child, that the school is going to perform a sex change operation on your child without your permission, and you utter patently false statements like that, essentially what you're doing is you're scapegoating an entire community. And the real problem is that this latest iteration of white Christian nationalism that is so prevalent in our partisan politics, at least, is uh, is problematic for that reason alone, that it plays the zero sum game of if I win, you lose. Instead of an ethic that is driven by 1 John 4:20, how can you love your neighbor who you see? How can you say you love God and hate your neighbor, right? Because you see your neighbor and you don't love your neighbor, but you claim to love God who you haven't seen. Again, we end up with these abstract frameworks about God that really put us in a bad light, because if we're honest with ourselves, the ethical ideas of Christianity mean nothing apart from concrete human relationships. They are literally meaningless. Now, we could talk about them and we could theorize about them in the abstract, but I, for one, am highly suspicious of any person who claims to be Christian who says that they have a good relationship with God and all of their personal relationships are horrible. That that becomes, to me, that becomes problematic, right? If we're going to hold on to ethical commitments, those commitments have to be applied in concrete human relationships. And that is not what we get from the culture wars with white Christian nationalism. What we get is a zero sum game of scapegoating, and the people scapegoated are those who can least afford to be scapegoated because they happen to be the most vulnerable members of our society.
And and if I may say, thank you, Dr. Alvin and Tim. If I may say, the culture war as waged by Christian nationalism, as you say, it's a zero sum game, and it seemed to me Christian nationalism, they are the aggressors. They are the ones who come. It is a dangerous war simply because, or precisely because, the war is to be won at any cost. You talk about zero sum goal. It has to be won at any cost. And these are Christians who are waging a war with whatever weapon they can find in their hands: misinformation, lies, actual guns, you know, um, uh, uh, the word of God, the Bible, to the extent that a criminal, a convicted criminal, is endorsing the Bible. His name is placed alongside all the holy people of God. This is a war being waged by any and insisted on being won by any means necessary. to the extent that we saw, remember who did we call America's pastor? Huh? Billy Graham. Billy Graham's son stands up with a presidential candidate. He stands with him after a hurricane. And as though he endorses all the lies he perpetuates after the hurricane for his own personal interest. This is part of the whole Christian nationalist toxic behavior that is permeating American society. And it is that's what I'm saying. It is something extremely dangerous, and I don't know the extent to which America realizes the war that is being waged against it. And I don't want to use the term enemy within, because it's not a good term. But sometimes when people use that term, we need to really rethink what we mean by that. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, it's extremely dangerous. I mean, man, it's so dangerous. I don't think we realize how dangerous it is, because you got, you know, the vilification, the demonization of other people, making yourself the victim to gain power, right? But that's not the end of the agenda. It's not just to gain power. The end goal would be to now almost enslave those who you feel like are under you, you know. So it goes deeper than that, and to kill, justify killing, you know, those kind of things. So I mean, this kind of propaganda is very dangerous, because it literally puts people's lives in danger. And if this kind of stuff is happening now, you know, I mean, what will happen, you know, when it gains, you know, if it gains full control? So I mean, it's something definitely you want to keep it out rather than get it in and deal with it. And so it's something very serious, you know, we have to take very seriously, because, you know, it really puts people's lives at stake, in a literal sense, that people, Christian nationalism, the culture war, the demonization, the vilification, the making yourself the victim to justify, you know, treating others unjustly, is definitely a dangerous concept. And of course, we see a lot of propaganda, right? A lot of misinformation that goes into it. And it's the thing, it's intentional. That's the thing. It's intentional. It's not ignorant. It's intentional. I'm trying to fire up the masses. I'm trying to deceive them. I'm trying to, you know, put out the propaganda. And so that's the dangerous part about it. It's extremely dangerous.
But in terms of the connection between Christianity and the project, and we've seen this before, as we mentioned, implicitly and explicitly in other parts of the conversation. It is the attempt to capture state power in the name of God.
It is, Michael, if I may just piggyback on what you said, I'm sorry for interrupting. It is a Constantinian project.
Yes.
It is doing with Christianity what Constantine did. He was no true convert to the religion. He simply misappropriated it to consolidate political power in the Roman Empire. And that, I think, is what is happening today. I'm sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, but I was going on to say that this is an archetype that we see throughout history and in other religious contexts as well. So Modi's project in India is basically saying the gods have given the Hindus the right to rule India through the power of the state. In Turkey, Erdogan is saying we Islamicize the Turkish state in the name for the sake of Islam. Never mind that there are other people of other traditions or who are secular people in Turkey. And you look around the world and around history, the idea to claim state power in the name of God, whoever your God or whatever you conceive him to be, is basically a Zionist project, lowercase Zionist. That is to say, the idea that God approves of a particular people, an ethno-state, with right to a particular territory and right to dominance in that territory. And that the instruments of state and of theology and of historical interpretation filtered through the Zionist project justifies the policies that are carried out in its name. So whether Zionism with a big Z, or with a small z in other instances, the archetype is the same: to capture and use state power in the name of the divine right to dominate. And if you plug that into the comparative for purposes of comparison, you can see the parallels, whether it's Islamic or in Israel, or Christian nationalism, or apartheid in South Africa with the Afrikaners. You can see many parallels in Afrikaner theology with the current theological experiments that are going on now. Same project. And in fact, they influenced each other historically. What happened in Germany, what happened in Germany with the Lutheran Church and parts of the Catholic Church in the 1930s in Germany, same animal, different painting, different paintings, different iconographies, different details of language, but the project to use the power of the state to justify and sanctify a particular interpretation of God and his will in the world through you, or through the dominant force.
And we see this, I think, in our own denomination, in a certain kind of abandonment of prophetic utterance around the United States of America. We typically do not like to preach the eschatology about America's role in the end of our theological beliefs, precisely because too many of us have bought into a white Christian nationalist view of power in which America has to win in the end, right? And America couldn't possibly do any of the things that our eschatology teaches, because to do that is to abandon the cherished views of America's imperial force as a defender of white supremacy.
And moreover, the concept of Babylon in Revelation is a mobile concept. It is not fixed to a particular geography in the Eastern Mediterranean or at the intersection of the Euphrates. Babylon is any historical power that uses the power of the state in the name of God to oppress people. That is a Babylon system, as the Rastafarians would say. So any use and the appropriation of an ethical language and a cosmology and frame of imposition upon others, even if you are asking them to do good things, it is right for the state to have laws against stealing and so on, and against murder. But the using the power of the state to tell people not only what you decide is right and wrong, but to impose it by force rather than leaving it to people to decide for themselves whether they will follow Christ from the convictions of the Holy Spirit, or whether they will follow your understanding of who Christ is from the imposition of the state. And that is the contrast between a prophetic outlook and a Babylonian outlook, if you will.
Yeah, and that's why John refers to ancient Rome as Babylon. Fallen is Babylon. That's why it's called Babylon, because it was imposing a mandatory imperial cult upon all citizens of the state. And that is what Christian nationalism is seeking. It's seeking to impose Christianity upon all citizens of the state, wanting to get the 10 Commandments in all schools and Bibles and all those things to force Christianity upon a nation that is becoming increasingly religiously pluralistic. So yeah, it does fit the Babylon mold. It is in an imperialistic state that John would indeed describe as Babylon. And if we really want to interpret Revelation contextually and relevantly, then let us look at what we're doing in America. And somebody asked what's happening in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Let's all ask ourselves the question, are we complicit? Or are we just caught up, in prophecy?
Well, just to complete the circle, Olive, there's a place in Revelation where John describes Jerusalem as Babylon. So Jerusalem, Egypt, and Babylon become the same term, meaning the same posture, the same relationships as Tim points out. So you look at the relationships. So even if Jerusalem claims to be the seat of inspiration and the receptacle of the oracles of God, it too can become Babylon.
Yes. Yeah. Any system can be Babylon.
Yes.
As long as you become a system of enforcing and co-opting the conscience of the individual outside of the constraints of a law that is reasonable,
Mm-hmm.
And
you become a Babylon system.
yeah, and it's also important to note that whatever virtue there is in any religion, whether they be Western monotheisms or Eastern polytheisms or whatever the religion is, whatever virtues the religion has dissolve when the religion is infused with state power and they become corrupted. Whatever good things there were about Christianity became corrupted. If Constantine was going to issue the Edict of Milan and end persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire, that would come at a cost to the integrity of certain Judeo Christian values. Chief among them would be the seventh day Sabbath, right? I mean, this is what would have to happen. Rome would now worship on the venerable day of the sun. So, whatever the most cherished virtues are of any religion are going to dissolve, resulting in an ersatz version of the religion that lacks the power to do good from the bottom up, as Dr. Allen put it, and now will do harm from the top down in an
Mm-hmm.
oppressive way.
And to reinforce the point that sometimes a necessary social problem is being addressed from the top. You
Right.
take the need for belonging. You take the need for a healthy intergenerational life. Children, parents in the middle, grandparents, and the longing for community, which we recognized afresh in the COVID pandemic when it was taken from us by medical necessity. But people recognize that social belonging is important to our mental and physical health. So the question is, in the atomization of these global neoliberal institutions and markets, where we are seen as consumers primarily and not as parts of communities in real relationship, in a sense, this document is saying we need a sense of community. We need a language of belonging. That's good. But the question is, how are we going to establish this language and this new soup environment of belonging? How is it to be created, and whose bowl is it going to set in? Who sets the mixture, and who hands out the nutrients when it's time to feed from it? And so this contest to shape what this, but the basis of belonging and social cohesion, necessary though they are, we have to examine what the agenda is in creating that the framing of that. Is it to be a language of division, or is it a language of that recognizes the humanity of everybody?
Thank you for that. If we're looking at our time, we want to have some closing remarks and then end our broadcast. It looks like we addressed the question. If you have anything more to elaborate on this particular question with regards to the church, I really want to make sure that that might be considered. I think some people hit it, but if you want to be a little bit more specific as it relates to that, that would be helpful. And as you hit it, the same person came back with what she heard and shared this with regards to, um, sounds like under the explanation that would make the SDA Church Babel. Seems NAD, I think she meant GC, does that across the world. So just want to make sure that's being considered as relates to your remarks as you close. We'll start off with Pastor Jones and then um, Dr. Golden, Dr. Hemings, and Dr. Allen.
All right, and we're still addressing the cultural within the church, right?
we're doing closing remarks
Okay.
and then seeing whether or not if you want to say something about that in the church, please do.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say that, the danger of Christian nationalism is that they're trying to create a false theocratical system where God does not reign, but man reigns. And whenever man reigns as supreme over the conscience, by whatever reason they're trying to get power, I mean, it always results in just total destruction of any nation. And so it's just dangerous on so many grounds. Of course, again, we're dealing with white Christian nationalism, which believes that the white man is dominant, and that everybody else is inferior. And of course, that I mean, it's just very dangerous. I go back. I mean, you go back to the book of Exodus, and literally, if you look at Exodus chapter 1, and you look at the whole concept of how Pharaoh was able to manipulate the Egyptians to be able to destroy and enslave the Israelites, you see that same parallel. I mean, the propaganda, the demonization, the villainization, making myself the victim, justifying killing and enslaving other people. Um, of course, you had Hebrew jobs versus versus Egyptian jobs. All that was there, right? And so you see those principles there, and so you see what it leads to. Of course, we haven't got to that point yet, but the Bible tells us that it gets the power grab gets stronger and stronger as it grows in strength. And so we definitely want to do everything we can to stop it, to speak out against it, not allow it to be empowered. Let's not allow it to be empowered. Let's not even allow um, that particular fruition to come to pass. And so my thing is, it's extremely dangerous. Again, with going back to the culture wars and Adventism, we have to accept um, prophecy as it is, not try to create this false view of how prophecy plays out. And it will force us to look at ourselves and see of course, the issues that are currently in the political realm or inside the church too, the demonization, those kind of things, and recognizing, the history of the United States, where it is, where we're going. I think having an honest conversation and receiving and accepting, and not trying to overlook that and come up with all kind of other religious liberty theories. No, the real religious liberty issue has nothing to do with COVID and COVID shots and vaccines. That's not religious liberty issues. The real religious issues is what we're dealing with today in the volatile environment in which we are seeing these political elections play, and the intentional lies and demonization and all these kind of things. That's religious liberty, and all the other things are distractions. And so we want to make sure we face the real issues. The real issues are what they are. We can't escape it. It is what it is, and we have to, in order to be able to truly fight against it, we have to be true to what it really is, identify and attack it for what it is.
Thank you so much, Dr. Golden.
I would hope that we take away from this discussion tonight the idea that no matter how much we try to globalize the church, and I understand we are a global denomination, the hard reality is that the Adventist church is originates in America, and it originates in the midst of a civil war that is being fought over the question of what to do with approximately 3.5 Black slaves.
Hmm.
And the sad reality of that is that the church has a legacy because of its origins that in many ways reflects the fractures that existed at the time of its inception. Those fractures today are Black and white. We have regional conferences, we have state conferences. And I'm not here to criticize or take a position on either one, but sometimes I think we like to export a brand of Adventism that is sanitized from white supremacy as manifested in American democracy, and that is a mistake. We shop ourselves around the world as God's chosen people, and all the while we work overtime to hide the warts of our denominational history, which again reflects the harsh racial realities of American history. And I think the sooner we come to grips with that, the easier it will be to confront white Christian nationalism for the scandal that it is, and hopefully begin to have some constructive dialogue about how to move forward. But any attempts to move forward without such recognition are ultimately futile and will do much more harm than good. And I've observed, this is my point to the culture wars. I have observed that um, a lot of people in the church have a bad habit of reducing every social issue to a matter of the right versus the left. And this sort of partisan, political, ideological viewpoint, it it really ruins any robust moral consideration of what these issues really are. So if you see unarmed black people, men and women, being shot and killed by the police, that's not a social issue that belongs to the left. That is an American problem. That is an American issue. And any person concerned about the United States of America ought to be concerned when a segment of its population does not believe that its political institutions work for them. That's not a problem that we relegate to the left or to the right. I find that a lot of the culture wars play themselves out in Adventism, with many of the white brethren wanting to hide behind conservative right wing politics to avoid any meaningful, robust conversations of moral, social, and political accountability for the injustice that is rampant. Justice is not a question of left or right, it is a question of right and wrong. And the sooner we realize that, the sooner the better off we will be as a denomination.
Thank you, Dr. Golden. Dr. Hemings.
So the question we must always be asking, what is Christianity? When we hear the term Christianity, what is Christianity? Because Christianity and Christ are not necessarily one and the same thing. One is not necessarily derived from the other. Christ is not a religion. Christ is a spirituality, a deep spirituality demonstrated and manifested in Jesus of Nazareth. And everybody needs to know who that Jesus is. We have been shown a false Jesus. We have been shown an idol placed in a box of the sky with long white hair, white face, and blue eyes, who defends the status quo. That's a false Jesus. When we know who Jesus is, then we will know what it really means to be a Christian. We will really know what Christ means. It means that we understand that all beings come from one single source. And if we love God and we claim to love God with all our soul and our might, we have to also claim to love our fellow humans with all our soul and our might. Because this is it. You know, there's a saying in Deuteronomy 6 verse 4, we call it Shema. Hear, O Israel, God is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your might. That's what it says. Now, we tend to take that to mean that there's a God up there seeking, a sort of egoistic demand of homage from humanity. But that's what it's about. Jesus tells us what it's about. Because Jesus added something to Shema. He goes to Numbers chapter 19 and added, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And he said that second one is like the first. John also says, you cannot claim to love God whom you have never seen, and yet you're a human being, your brother and sister is right in front of you, and you don't love them. So to love God, to be a truly religious person, is not about ideologies. It's not about what I believe and what I don't believe. It's about one single thing when Jesus says it. This is what the law and the prophets is about. In other words, this is what the scripture is about. That's what law and the prophet means, scripture. Love God with all your heart and your mind, meaning love your neighbor as yourself. That's actually a better reading of it. So I'll end by saying this, friends. Anybody comes to you shaking a Bible at you, view them with suspicion. And especially if that Bible is endorsed by um, the former president of the United States, turn around and rebuke them in the name of Jesus. That's all I have to say today. God bless you all.
Amen. Thank you, Dr. Hemings. The question was asked about how do we turn the spotlight on Adventism? I have a certain ambivalence toward my church. It's like getting from 0 to 40 miles an hour, but can't get any faster than that. The church has several good insights, almost an attempt to complete the Reformation. And we come to the edges of going into a more abundant life, but we keep putting it off. So we have good insights on health. We have good insights on the Sabbath. And even the Sabbath is limited in its meaning because we fail to see the liberatory implications of it, the rest, the shalom, the peace that it means. So we have great institutions of education and of healthcare, but even the healthcare has become a health business rather than a missionary arm of the gospel. And our educational institutions are held back by a kind of theology that is trapped in a 19th century framework. And the movement that I see in scripture of God's shining light, shining more and more into the perfect day to expand our understanding of what justice and health and peace and freedom mean, I see a movement throughout scripture. But we have a hermeneutic that locks teachings into a box, and so our teachings are about preservation rather than about advancement. We are doctrine preservers rather than truth seekers, and that to me is the great holdback, the great contradiction of Adventist theology and practice, and it gets reflected in our institutional behaviors. So that now we have become more authoritarian than democratic. We are more top down than middle up. And the president of the General Conference gets to manipulate the vote to pass things, to frustrate ordination of women and to frustrate theological innovation around the interface of science and theology and all kinds of questions, medicine and ethics, all these kinds of questions that are at the cutting edge of Christian practice and social need at the moment. We don't face up to them because our theology is so. I said to a friend the other day, truth is more like a river than a rock. A river flows and it gathers momentum and it waters roots as it goes along. A rock is fixed. And so while it seems permanent and strong, it is the wrong image of what truth is. And so our practice thinks of the truth as a rock that we stand on rather than a river that moves us forward and waters as we go along. And I wish that a renaissance would come in Adventism that allows us past that conception, that now allows us to re-energize education and research and theology and healthcare and mission and governance.
Well, once again, we want to thank our distinguished panel for joining us this evening. We appreciate the insightful perspective and what you've shared to engage our audience with regards to Christian nationalism and privilege. What's love got to do with it? We want to encourage everyone to make sure that you are registered to vote and make a plan to vote no later than Tuesday, November 5th. Some of your states have early voting, you have absentee voting, and we want to make sure that your vote counts. So we once again want to encourage you to ensure that you're registered to vote and you have a plan to vote no later than Tuesday, November 5th. Once again, this has been CJC Today with a distinguished panel of Dr. Michael Allen, Dr. Olive Hemings, Pastor Kerwin Jones, and Dr. Timothy J. Golden. We appreciate you listening to us, and we invite you to go back and check the entire series of Christian Nationalism and Privilege on our YouTube channel, where you can hear the entire series at that time. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. God bless you, and have a happy Sabbath. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.